I was going to make this video earlier, but it made more sense to hold off and wait for House of the Dragon to end, because I'm curious where it would fit in comparison to every Game of Thrones season. I've also done an in-depth analysis / review on each season of Game of Thrones, so it finally makes sense to rank them. Season 8. It comes as absolutely no surprise that Season 8 of Game of Thrones is at the bottom of my ranking. Even Season 7, which isn't good on its own, still far and away outshines Season 8. This season isn't just bad, with an onslaught of atrocious dialogue, character turns, idiotic plot beats, bad editing, and incomprehensibly dumb moments. It's also just flat out insulting. Like, I could be somewhat at peace if the final season was just bad in the mediocre sense, like Season 7, but so many major story beats are so completely brain dead, to the point that anyone with a pencil and 2 brain cells could do a better job. Daenerys' sudden and unjustified turn despite being in a winning scenario, Bran becoming king because he has a good story, butchering Jaime's entire arc in 1 sentence, the egregious amount of plot armor on display, installing a worse form of government than before. I mean, I could go on for like 5 minutes of just listing shit out. Season 8 makes my blood boil, and the second I revisit it, it's like reigniting a wildfire explosion in my mind where I remember all the heaps of trash that's within this season. And it completely sucks that the rest of the show is so amazing because it's hard to recommend this show now. Hey, watch this excellent show that has one of the worst ending seasons in history. I'm sure you'll love it, smile. And it even ruins rewatch potential because knowing that everything leads to this dumbass smirking at me while becoming king is not worth the time. There are very few redeeming qualities about this season, like Brienne getting knighted, but it's really hard to remember that from it drastically getting overshadowed by all the horrendous material in the season. I genuinely don't know how David and Dan can write a season so badly while also having extra time to do so, and the only answer I can think of is them wanting to leave ASAP to quote-unquote work on better things, despite getting dropped by Disney for their Star Wars project. So get rolled, David and Dan, the North remembers. Season 7. Yeah, these 2 first rankings are pretty much given since Season 7 and 8 are by far the 2 worst seasons in the show, because at least Seasons 5 and 6 have some bigger redeeming qualities than Season 7. Like, the only thing I can think of is some of the character work at times is alright to good, and the Spoils of War was a pretty fun action sequence despite some hiccups in the writing. But that's really it. Looking towards the latter part of the season, we have the completely absurd voyage beyond the wall to capture a white plotline, and then trying to convince Cersei to help them in fighting the undead. The fact that the last 3 episodes hinge on this singular plan pretty much ruins the season. Leading up to that point, it was mostly mediocre, but the Beyond the Wall sequence is shockingly dumb. Like, what were David and Dan smoking? Not only do our main characters have to pull off a miraculously impossible heist that should have gotten them all killed, but they also have to persuade Cersei, who is notoriously stubborn about helping people, let alone her enemy. And the fact that this plan is coming from Tyrion is the funniest part of all of it. The smartest character in the show reduced to arguably one of the dumbest in the show. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if Hodor was smarter at this point.
I'm about to step into a room with the most murderous woman in the world who's already tried to kill me twice. That I know of. Who's an idiot?
Like, why wouldn't his grand plan have Daenerys fly everyone in and out when capturing a white? Did they think they would get all the way back to the wall uncontested? Let alone doing the plan to begin with? Because everyone involved should have known the outcome regardless. So the execution of Beyond the Wall was obviously terrible, and the finale was so underwhelming because it accomplished nothing. The only thing it accomplished was making Jamie mad and leaving, and that was really it. David and Dan just wanted to get every character on screen together, but had no idea what that reason would be for. Looking at the first few episodes of the season, they are pretty competent, even though there are still some dumb aspects like Euron's fleet teleporting around and Varys not knowing about it, the Tyrells having virtually no military strength, and the population of King's Landing suddenly being really friendly, to name a few issues. But this is balanced out by some good scenes, like Lady Olenna's badass death, and some reunions. So it's not an entirely miserable experience like Season 8 was. Season 5. This may be a little bit of a shock, but I like Season 6 a little bit more than Season 5, because there are still some aspects of Season 6 that are pretty enjoyable. The main issue with Season 5, as I pointed out in my analysis, is that the entire season is really dull. Most main characters are faced with boring conflicts like the introduction of the Sparrows, Sons of the Harpy, and the Sand Snakes. These conflicts to me are inherently more interesting in Season 6 because we experienced their payoff, which was better than their build-up. Then other main characters like Sansa, Arya, and Tyrion have arguably the least interesting journey in the show this season. Sansa gets pawned off by Littlefinger to Ramsay for literally no reason, and in the process alienates the most valued possession that he loves. At one point, George R. R. Martin said that Littlefinger would never do that in his books because, rightfully so, it breaks his character. And as a result of all this nonsense, we get a dumb plotline of Sansa getting tormented. Arya starts her training to be a faceless assassin, and for all the hype to get there, I'd much rather be back with the Hound in seasons 3 and 4. Because holy shit, her scenes in the House of Black and White are so boring and meaningless that it chips away at my soul. So many of her scenes revolve around doing nonsense chores that don't teach her anything, and it's so clear that she's lying about being no one. Then for Tyrion, David and Dan have clearly shown that they have no idea how to write an intellectual character, so they just evolved into turning most of his dialogue into comedic relief. His dynamic with Varys becomes insufferable, and what was once an intriguing discussion between two smart peers becomes an annoying married couple who are constantly bickering.
Can't remember the last face I saw that wasn't yours.
It's a perfectly good face.
I'm losing my mind.
When Tyrion meets up with Ser Jorah, the dialogue gets more interesting, but this journey is still drastically outclassed by anything in King's Landing. Looking at the peak of Season 5, we have Hardhome and the climaxes that happen at the end of the season. Like, it's really hard to remember much from the middle of the season, and the death of Ser Barristan was truly the first moment the show made a major mistake. But Hardhome definitely recovers the season a bit, and the conclusions for Daenerys, Jon Snow, and Cersei were great. The same can't be said for Stannis Baratheon though. One of the more cool and badass characters goes out with such a whimper, and his whole journey felt very underwhelming. Although the death of Shireen was a definite highlight. Overall, Season 5 is alright, but has a lot of bad material like the Sand Snakes that weigh the season down a lot. Season 6. If it wasn't for all the crazy payoff within the season like the Hodor Revelation, the Battle of the Bastards, and the entirety of the Winds of Winter, then I would probably put this season at the same bar as Season 5. However, this season has the lucky circumstance of Season 5 doing a lot of the heavy lifting of dredging through the mediocre plotlines, like the Sparrows and the Sons of the Harpy, so we can get to the payoff. Because the Trial of the Seven sequence was easily one of the best scenes in the show, but the same can't be said for most sequences like the Siege of Meereen, and how idiotic the Master's plan was to assault Daenerys, who has a much stronger army and dragons. But at least that got her closer to leaving and going to Westeros. Season 6 to me is just inherently more interesting than Season 5. Arya is now overcoming a more interesting conflict, Tyrion is in a position that can test his abilities, despite him being very dumb, Cersei isn't locked away in a cell for half the season, Bran is actually present, and we get backstory for the Three-Eyed Raven, Jamie doing anything else other than wandering around in Dorne is an upgrade, and Jon has to overcome Ramsay in a climactic and epic battle. The main downside for this season is that these more interesting plotlines are bogged down by David and Dan's notorious bad writing, more so than Season 5. From the Battle of the Bastards including major contrivances, Arya becoming immortal, Tyrion's dialogue and intellect falling further into the abyss of stupidity, and Sansa trusting Littlefinger after everything he has done to her are just a few things I can think of off the top of my head. This may all sound very damning, but you have to remember that Season 6 is very inconsistent in terms of quality. You have all these issues that are then accompanied by scenes that range from good to great. So even though Season 6 has bigger lows than Season 5, I think the season simultaneously has bigger highs that are more alluring. House of the Dragon Season 1. I think this is the most agreed upon placement for House of the Dragon to be in, because on one hand, it's really close to matching the quality of the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones, while on the other, it's much better than the later seasons. David and Dan really struggled to write dialogue that was of the same caliber of George R. R. Martin's. Meanwhile, in House of the Dragon, I think they did a great job with the dialogue, and it perfectly blends into the quality standards that fans expect from this franchise. At no point am I physically cringing from how stupid the lines are, and the characters feel fully realized by the writers. They're so riveting, and since we have a more condensed focus on a smaller amount of characters, House of the Dragon was able to create some outstanding dramatic moments without a lot of spectacle. Because going into the show, I thought it was going to be heavily reliant on action and dragon VFX, but the first season instead focuses more on building characters and the conflict between all of them. This is essentially the core DNA of what makes Game of Thrones work so well, so it's really nice to see it be focused on here. I was very close to putting House of the Dragon over the next placement, but there were a couple aspects that held it back, which were the excessive time jumps, some wonky moments in the writing, and the ramifications of speeding through the story too fast. Despite all of the negative reviews calling the show boring, I actually think the show should have taken more time. However, it's understandable that they didn't want to exceed 10 episodes, so they did the best they could do. On a comparison basis for the first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones, I think the biggest aspect that GoT has over HOTD is that the story is more of a roller coaster with tons of twists and major revelations. While the first season of House of the Dragon is like a hydraulic launch that is about to propel you into the craziness that is yet to come. HOTD is easily a great addition, and I hope the next season has the strength to break through the quality of the first 4 seasons. Season 2. Out of the first 4 seasons, Season 2 is towards the bottom for me because there are some issues I have with it, and I'll focus primarily on them for this segment, but keep in mind that the writing in every dialogue scene still exudes a staggering level of quality. So even though I'm going to be focusing on some of the negatives, this is still in my top 4. There are 2 major plotlines that weigh the season down, which are Daenerys hanging out in Karth, and Jon and company wandering around north of the Wall. For these 2 plotlines in comparison to where their stories are in seasons 1, 3, and 4, they are drastically outclassed. Because for those other seasons, Jon and Dany go through massive journeys that thoroughly develop them as characters, and that's also accompanied by great conflict to push them to change. Then looking at one more negative aspect is that the budget for season 2 still wasn't that large yet, so the Battle of the Five Kings didn't really feel like a battle happening throughout Westeros. So many scenes were skipped over because the budget for the show simply wasn't big enough yet. The scope and scale because of this weren't able to be achieved at their highest potential. David and Dan only had enough money to do the Blackwater battle, which that battle on its own was outstanding. Just imagine if they didn't have to cut out any battles this season and actually showed Robb Stark going on a conquest, thus making him even more of a badass and a likable character. Now, for season 2, this wasn't a crippling issue because of the fact that every scene that replaced the more expensive ones were still pretty good. The dialogue scenes were entrancing and gave every character deep development, along with showing varying perspectives and philosophies associated with each character. My favorite of the bunch is between Tyrion and Cersei. There's so much subtext to be mined from their relationship due to their rich history together that makes every scene they have very insightful and intriguing. Then you can basically apply that fact to every other dialogue scene because the world of Game of Thrones is so layered that you're constantly either learning about the character or the world to some degree from that character's perspective, making the story constantly riveting. And I haven't even gone into the masterful Blackwater sequence that was perfectly built up, with great tension and rocking a perfect execution of spectacle and gritty violence. Even with some of season 2's shortfalls and the fact that the plot doesn't pop off as much as other seasons, it still manages to be an excellent season of Game of Thrones. Season 3. Now, this is extremely hard, and I can honestly interchange any of the next 3 seasons because of how magnificent they all are. But just barely, I'm going to put season 3 under seasons 1 and 4, because those seasons are essentially perfect. The only flaws I have with season 3 are the anticlimactic battle of Yunkai, Theon getting tortured all season became a little repetitive, and the King's Landing narrative to me is weaker than the other 3 first seasons. Not saying it's bad in any way, and it's still really good. The political dance between Tywin and Olenna as they manipulate their children on its own is amazing. But to me, the death of Ned Stark, the Blackwater, and the chaos of season 4 outshines that ever so slightly. And honestly will come down to preference as to which one of those narratives is your favorite. But yeah, those are really the only negative things I can think of because there are so many great aspects to be enjoyed. From the best scene in the show of the Red Wedding, Jamie losing his hand and having his bath monologue, Dany acquiring the Unsullied, Tywin exploding at his children, and Jon Snow romancing Ygritte all season leaves no dull moments for season 3. Every plotline is extremely entertaining. I think the Red Wedding alone would push the season to the top of some of your rankings, and I can totally understand that. George R.R. Martin somehow one-upped one of the biggest twists in entertainment, and this time it's even more shocking. An entire plotline that we perceived as being the main one just comes to a complete stop. I don't think that has ever happened before, because at least the death of Ned Stark wasn't the complete ending to a whole plotline. This is also to me the best season for Daenerys. She's finally accumulating a lot of power, and it's such a fun ride as she tears through Essos. This is where she becomes an iconic character. Season 3 has so many great scenes to the point that I wouldn't be surprised if this is your favorite season. Season 1. This season will always be very close to my heart from how expertly executed it all was. All of the daunting exposition and setup for every character is never tedious, and you're always engaged by the electrifying story that immediately grabs your attention. The fact that the first season of a show is one of the best is such a hard feat to pull off. George R. R. Martin engrosses us with a captivating mystery that is laced with so many plot twists to the point that we can't stop watching. Like once you get to the 4th episode, the pace of the show quickly picks up and you can't stop yourself. Although that could be the case for the first episode too, with Bran getting yeeted out of a window. The even crazier part is that the main plotline in King's Landing is accompanied by equally great stories with Jon Snow, Daenerys, and Tyrion. The Night's Watch offers a great contrast being set in the north, and the slow buildup of camaraderie between the brothers is so endearing. Daenerys finding her identity and becoming a leader, paired with the tragic fate of Khal Drogo, cements this world as not being plagued by cheap writing. And then Tyrion has a consistently exciting journey across Westeros. Any of the plotlines in this season are always fun to watch. The only reason why I wouldn't put this season at my top spot is that the season does have to get the ball rolling, as opposed to later seasons where they come in swinging right out of the gate and is a wild ride from start to finish. That initial barrier of getting everything going holds the season back a smidge, and in the grand scheme of things, it's really not a big deal considering that it's in my 2nd spot, because the death of Ned Stark propels this season to astronomical heights. Even knowing about that twist when starting the show, I was still completely floored by what the ramifications meant in the story. Just absolutely genius story direction in general. Season 4. It's a bit of a spoiler that I put in my Season 4 analysis that it's the best season. If you think that Season 1 was a wild ride, then Season 4 just ups it in all regards. Because just in King's Landing alone, we go from the out-of-nowhere brutal death of Joffrey, Tyrion's iconic trial speech that he won an Emmy for, Oberyn coming in from left field to declare himself our Tyrion's champion, Oberyn getting his head smashed in after we thought he won, and then Tyrion killing his love and his father in one season. Let alone the rest of what happens in the season. Almost every episode is packed with an absolute banger of a plot point that you are constantly floored by how the season can stay this amazing. Like even with Oberyn declaring himself for Tyrion, the episode still continues and ends with Littlefinger pushing Lysa Arryn through the moon door. I look at each of the last 5 episodes and they all have some of my favorite scenes in the entire show. And that's not to say that the first 5 episodes don't have anything great going for them either. Like we have the Hound rolling people for chicken, Daenerys seizing Meereen, Jon killing the mutineers at Craster's Keep, and obviously, Joffrey choking on some pie. It feels like every episode has an orgasmic climax that sends my brain on a dopamine parade. Then this is arguably some of the best arcs for our characters like Tyrion, Arya, and Jon. Tyrion hits his lowest point and nothing holds him back from unleashing all his anger. Arya's journey with the Hound is a surprising delight as she slowly comes to grow a fondness for him as a father figure of sorts. The fact that the Hound even shares the sentiment by the end marks a great endpoint for his overall character arc. And then Jon has a massive moral dilemma in which he has to protect his brothers from the wildlings, despite him actually agreeing with their cause and having personal stakes in them with Ygritte. This isn't even mentioning that the Watchers on the Wall is in this season, which is by far my favorite episode in the show. Some of the best action, dialogue, set pieces, and heart-wrenching character moments can be found in this episode. I feel like I can start any episode in this season and immediately become entranced by the immense quality that each one has. I love season 4, and there might be a couple of small flaws here and there, like the terrible editing in the Hound and Brienne's fight scene, but the story peaks here on almost every front to the point that they don't matter. Thank you for watching, and let me know in the comments what your ranking of the seasons is.